Chapter 1. The Unsolvable. Murder It was a brisk autumn morning when Captain Hastings found himself walking briskly up to the front door of Henrietta Bloom's home. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed garden, its cool light beginning to filter through the amber leaves of the trees. There was an air of stillness about the place, as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Hastings pressed the doorbell, his face set with unease, his brow furrowed in thought. His usual confident stride was absent today, replaced by the sort of cautious hesitation that spoke volumes about the gravity of the matter. The door opened slowly, revealing the housekeeper, Mrs. Corbin, her expression one of deep distress. "Captain Hastings," she said, her voice wavering. "It's terrible, truly terrible." Hastings stepped inside, removing his hat and his overcoat. "What has happened, Mrs. Corbin? Where is Mrs. Bloom?" The housekeeper's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly turned away to compose herself. "In her study, Captain. We found her there. It's the most dreadful thing, sir. I don't know how to explain it." Hastings followed her down the corridor, his steps quickening with each passing second. The heavy silence of the house seemed to weigh down on him, his heart pounding in his chest. He entered the study without hesitation, but then stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. Henrietta Bloom lay slumped over her desk, her head resting against the open pages of a manuscript. The room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of wind outside the window. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, offering the only warmth to combat the chill in the room. What struck Hastings immediately, however, was the singularity of the scene, the one thing that stood out like a glaring anomaly in the otherwise orderly space. The manuscript, her latest work, was open before her, its contents appearing strange. The symbols on the page were unlike any he had seen before, a series of incomprehensible marks, the significance of which was lost on him. He could not even tell whether they were written words at all. The author, once a woman of such boundless energy of wit and imagination, was now gone, and in her place only the cold, lifeless body remained. The strangeness of the scene sent a shiver down Hastings's spine. How had this happened, and why? What possible reason could anyone have to harm a woman who had brought so much joy through her books? "Mrs. Corbin?" he asked quietly, his voice a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. "Has anyone been in or out of this room since you found her?" She shook her head. "No, Captain, no one. At that moment there was the sound of footsteps from behind them, and they both turned to find a small, neatly dressed man entering the room. His thick moustache, perfectly groomed, twitched as he surveyed the scene with a sharp yet calm gaze. He was short, but carried himself with an air of such quiet authority that he seemed to fill the room despite his size. "Ah, mon ami, it is as I feared," said Hercule Poirot, his voice soft but deliberate, as though every word were weighed with meaning. "What do we have here?" Hastings let out a breath of relief, though his face remained tense. "Poirot, thank goodness you're here. This is beyond me. I don't know what to make of it. A murder, and no sign of how it happened." Poirot studied the scene with the precision of a surgeon. He glanced briefly at Henrietta's body, his eyes narrowing slightly, but it was the manuscript that held his attention. He stepped forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the floor, and leaned over the desk, inspecting the book with intense scrutiny. "This manuscript," he said, his voice light but tinged with intrigue. "It is a most curious thing. One would think it a simple work of fiction, yet this one cannot read it. Not yet, at least." Hastings stood beside him, confused. "What do you mean? It's just a book, surely?" Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes glimmering with that familiar gleam of insight. "Ah, mon ami, that is where you are wrong. It is not just a book. There is something more here, something hidden, something that the late Mrs. Bloom intended to reveal, but not in the way one would expect. This manuscript is the key to the mystery, I believe." "But it's all gibberish," Hastings protested, his frustration rising. "We've tried to make sense of it, but none of it makes any sense." Poirot's gaze never left the pages of the book. "Gibberish, yes, but there is a method too. This madness, I am certain of it. This was no random scrawl, no meaningless jumble of words. Mrs. Bloom was a woman of great intellect, was she not? Surely she would not have written something without purpose." Poirot turned slowly, his sharp eyes studying the room and its contents with an air of quiet calculation. "You say the door was not disturbed, that no one came or went?" Mrs. Corbin nodded, her face pale. "Yes, Captain, we have not touched anything." Poirot stepped away from the desk, his thoughts whirring behind his composed exterior. He had been called to solve this mystery, and though the scene seemed hopelessly enigmatic, he was certain it held a logic, a pattern that simply had to be uncovered. "The one who has done this," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone, "else is someone who understood the victim, someone who knew her well enough to know the significance of this book." Hastings frowned. "But Poirot, no one can understand this book. It's just nonsense." Poirot smiled faintly, a small, knowing smile that always seemed to signal a breakthrough in his mind. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, mon ami. Every puzzle, every mystery, there is always a solution, if one is patient enough to search for it." Poirot turned to Mrs. Corbin. "Madame, I will need you to gather the other members of the household. We will need to speak with them one by one." Hastings nodded. "What are you thinking, Poirot? Who would want to kill Henrietta Bloom?" Poirot gave a small, thoughtful pause. "I do not yet know, Hastings, but rest assured the answer lies in the pages of that book, and in the minds of those closest to the late Mrs. Bloom." As Hastings moved to follow Mrs. Corbin out of the room, Poirot remained standing at the desk, staring at the open manuscript. A slight crease formed between his brows, and his lips parted as though he were about to speak, but he remained silent, lost in thought. His little grey cells were already at work. The game had begun. Chapter 2. The Players and the Clouets. The heavy silence of the study began to stretch. Poirot stood motionless, the flickering light of the fire casting long shadows across the room. His mind was already working, sifting through the pieces of the puzzle he had uncovered so far. The manuscript before him, with its strange and indecipherable symbols, was clearly the key. Of that he was certain. But what exactly it hid, and why it had been left behind in such a dramatic manner, were still questions that loomed large. "I will need to speak with each of the individuals in the house," Poirot finally said, his voice breaking the quiet. "There are always signs, small signs, mon ami. We must look for them." Hastings, who had been standing near the door, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, nodded solemnly. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Corbin, seems distraught, Poirot. I'm sure she will tell us all she knows, but I must say I am unsure of where to begin. Who would want to kill Henrietta Bloom?" Poirot raised a hand, a gesture that stilled the air between them. "The motive, Hastings, is often something hidden in the background. It is there, but concealed from the eye, like the small details in a painting that become clear only when one steps back. We will begin with Mrs. Corbin. Yes, but not yet. First, I must see the other players in this drama. The hallway outside Henrietta Bloom's study was quiet, save for the soft murmur of voices drifting from the drawing-room. Poirot led Hastings toward the open door, where a tall, thin man stood, his hands in his pockets, gazing out of the window, as though lost in thought. This man was none other than Gregory Bloom, the victim's husband. A man in his late 40s, he exuded an air of barely restrained tension, his usually neat hair dishevelled, as though the events of the morning had unsettled him more deeply than he cared to admit. Poirot studied him carefully, noting the slight twitch in the man's jaw as he turned to greet them. "Poirot," Gregory Bloom said, his voice strained. "I'm glad you're here. I can't believe this has happened. Henrietta, dead. In such a way. It's impossible to understand." The words were no more than an expression of shock, and Poirot's sharp mind could already tell that the sincerity was real, at least on the surface. But there was something about Gregory Bloom's eyes, something unspoken that made Poirot pause. "Your wife," Poirot began gently, his accent lilting the syllables, "was known by many for her remarkable intellect and talent. A woman of much success, yes?" Gregory's lips tightened for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "She was brilliant. She had her critics, of course. There were those who resented her success, but none of it ever bothered her. She was always so focused on her work." "Focused on her work," Poirot echoed, his voice soft as he turned toward the drawing-room. "And yet, Monsieur Bloom, there is something strange about her final work? A manuscript, perhaps, left open on the desk? I have seen it. There are symbols, not words. The book seems to hold something important." Gregory's face paled slightly. "The manuscript. Yes, she spoke of it often. She had said it was the culmination of years of research. But those symbols, I have no idea what they mean. They are nothing like any of her previous works." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You do not think, perhaps, that someone would want to harm her because of this new work? There must be something in it that someone wished to silence." Gregory shook his head vehemently, his hands now gripping the arm of the chair he had been leaning against. No, I don't think so. It was just a book about mythology, I believe. She was excited to finish it, but no one could have known, not even me. I couldn't understand it." Poirot stepped forward, his eyes briefly flickering toward the manuscript on the desk. He noted the man's unease, but it wasn't enough to reveal guilt. "Very well, Monsieur Bloom. I shall need to speak to the others, if you will excuse me." Gregory stood abruptly. "Of course, whatever you need. But please, Poirot, find out who did this." Poirot gave a slight bow, a gesture that spoke more of respect than submission, and turned to leave. As he walked toward the door, he caught a glimpse of the next figure in the household, a woman standing in the doorway to the study. She was tall and slender, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed too intense for a mere visitor. This was Charlotte Delacour, a well-known rival author of Henrietta Bloom. The tension between the two women had been public knowledge. Charlotte had never concealed her jealousy of Henrietta's success. Poirot, I presume. Charlotte's voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like polished stone. Poirot regarded her coolly. "Madame Delacour, I believe we have met before, though briefly. You are acquainted with the late Mrs. Bloom." Her lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Acquainted? Certainly. We were rivals in every sense. But I am not here to mourn. I'm here to see justice done. Henrietta's death was unexpected, and terribly convenient for some people, don't you think? Poirot raised an eyebrow. Convenient, you say? Of course, Charlotte said, her smile sharpening. She was the most successful author of her generation. Perhaps someone grew tired of her shadow. Someone who wanted to step into the light? Poirot's eyes flickered with interest, but his face remained impassive. And you, madam? What of you? Do you think the motive lies in professional envy? Charlotte's expression hardened, her gaze briefly flickering to the manuscript. I have no idea. I haven't seen that book before, nor do I care to. If you're asking me... If I had anything to do with her death, I'll tell you now, I didn't. But I can't say I'll miss her either. Poirot took in her words with the same careful attention that he gave to all things. There was bitterness in Charlotte's tone, but Poirot suspected this was not the core of the mystery. No, it was more than simple rivalry. And what of the publisher? Poirot asked, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. Her lips twisted into a sardonic smile. Ah, yes, Edward Harrington. You should speak to him. He and Henrietta were quite close, you know. He was her business partner, always, looking for the next great book. But I suspect he wanted to see her work end. She was a bit too independent for his tastes. Poirot bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. I will, madame. You have been most helpful. As Charlotte moved away, Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. We have learned much, mon ami, but I believe the most important clue still lies in the manuscript. There is something there, something that no one here has seen. The room felt colder as Poirot turned back toward the desk. He paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the strange symbols. What did they mean? Why had Henrietta Bloom chosen this particular moment to leave such an enigmatic clue behind? The answer was hidden there, of that he was certain. Hastings stepped up beside him, his face thoughtful. So, what do we do now, Poirot? Poirot's eyes sparkled with intensity, his voice low but firm. Now, mon ami, we look at the puzzle as a whole. We look at the book, at the people, and we ask, what is it, mon ami, that this book truly hides? With a final glance at the manuscript, Poirot turned toward the door. The game was afoot. Chapter Sound 3. The First Suspect. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the drawing room as Poirot and Hastings took their seats. Henrietta Bloom's husband, Dr. Edmund Bloom, had retreated to his study for a moment, though he had agreed to meet with Poirot. The man's emotions were as complex as they were carefully contained, a contradiction that Poirot couldn't ignore. Hastings, in contrast, was more visibly shaken, his brow furrowed with confusion as he leaned closer to Poirot. Do you think he's guilty, Poirot? He seems so detached. But then his reaction was so genuine when we first spoke to him. It's hard to know what to make of it. Poirot stroked his moustache, his eyes gleaming with the quiet intensity that always preceded one of his insights. Ah, Hastings, that is the very crux of the matter, no? He is distraught, yet not distraught enough. He is too measured, too controlled for a man who has just lost his wife in such a brutal manner. Hastings blinked in confusion. What do you mean? Poirot leaned forward, his voice low. Emotions are like small boats in a storm, my friend. They either bob wildly or remain eerily still. Monsieur Bloom's calmness is unnatural, and that, mon ami, is what we must investigate. The answer lies in what he does not say, as much as in what he does. It was then that Dr. Edmund Bloom entered the room. His face was pale, and his eyes bore the haunted look of someone caught in an unrelenting nightmare. Yet even as he stepped forward, his movements were stiff, mechanical, like a man who had long practiced how to act in times of crisis. I hope I have not kept you waiting," Dr. Bloom said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. He looked at Poirot as if measuring him carefully, as though deciding what he should reveal. "Not at all, Monsieur Bloom," Poirot replied with a polite smile. "I was hoping you might shed some light on how this tragedy could have come to pass." Dr. Bloom sat across from them, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of his chair. He seemed uncomfortable under Poirot's gaze, as though trying to maintain composure in the face of something far too overwhelming to manage. "Of course," Dr. Bloom said, his voice cracking slightly. I still can't believe she's gone. Henrietta and we had our differences, but I never imagined anything like this. We were supposed to grow old together." Poirot's sharp eyes remained on the man's face, looking for any discrepancy in his words. "Differences, you say? You and your wife? You did not get along?" Dr. Bloom hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "We were not exactly the perfect couple, if you want to know the truth. She was always absorbed in her work, you know. She didn't have time for anything else." Hastings, whose eyes had been darting between the two men, spoke up. "I suppose her work was her passion, then?" Dr. Bloom nodded, his gaze shifting downward. "Yes, it was everything to her. That manuscript, the one that was found on her desk. It was supposed to be her greatest work, but she was so secretive about it. She wouldn't let me see it." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "She would not let you see it, monsieur?" "No," Dr. Bloom said, his voice growing more intense. "She was very protective of that manuscript. She told me she was writing something different, something important. But I never saw it. She would not allow it." Poirot made a mental note of the man's reaction. His words were consistent, but his body language, rigid, hands clenched, spoke volumes. Dr. Bloom was clearly holding something back, and it wasn't merely grief. "Tell me," Poirot continued, "where were you last night, when your wife was attacked?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Dr. Bloom answered, his voice tight. "I was at the library, working on my own research. I had a meeting with my colleagues until late. I didn't get home until after midnight." Poirot's eyes flicked to Hastings, who raised an eyebrow in silent question. Poirot gave a slight nod, indicating that he was suspicious of the alibi. "You didn't notice anything unusual?" Hastings asked, his voice careful. "A sound, perhaps, or a disturbance in the house?" Dr. Bloom shook his head again, his expression distant. "No, the house was quiet when I returned. It's always quiet at that hour." Poirot remained silent for a moment, absorbing the subtle discomfort in the man's response. Something about his alibi didn't sit right. If he had been out, working with colleagues, why did his story feel so rehearsed, so meticulously polished? "I see," Poirot finally said, his tone soft but probing. "And what about the manuscript? You say she kept it from you. Yet you have seen it now. What do you make of those symbols?" Dr. Bloom's eyes darkened at the mention of the manuscript. "I have no idea. It's gibberish, that's what it is. Henrietta was always the brilliant one when it came to those things. I never understood half of it." Poirot studied the man for a long moment before speaking again, his voice almost too soft to hear. "Perhaps you did not understand it, but did you try to understand it, Monsieur Bloom? Did you ever ask your wife what it was? You did not try to look at it?" Dr. Bloom's face twitched slightly, but he recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing. "I told you she wouldn't let me." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "That is a curious thing, is it not? A wife who keeps her work, her final work, from her husband. There is a mystery there, perhaps more than a mere manuscript. Would you not agree, Hastings?" Hastings, who had been listening intently, nodded. "Yes, very curious indeed." Poirot turned back to Dr. Bloom. "Monsieur Bloom, I think we shall have to revisit your alibi. It is not as solid as you believe." Dr. Bloom's eyes flickered briefly with something that might have been fear, but it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "What are you implying, Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Nothing, monsieur, not yet, but rest assured, I will be speaking to your colleagues at the library. I believe they may have some insights into your evening." As Dr. Bloom left the room, a sense of unease lingered in the air. Poirot could feel the weight of the mystery settling over him, but one thing was certain. Dr. Edmund Bloom was not the straightforward grieving widower he appeared to be. Hastings, whose curiosity had been piqued, spoke up. "So you think he's hiding something, Poirot?" Poirot nodded, his eyes reflecting the sharp clarity of his reasoning. "Mon ami, it is always the small things, the slight inconsistencies, that betray the truth. Dr. Bloom is too careful in his grief. His alibi is questionable, and his obsession with the manuscript. It is as though he is hiding something, perhaps more than just a book." Hastings leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "But do you think he's guilty of murder?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with quiet certainty. "Not yet. But he is one of the pieces, mon ami, and every puzzle piece must be examined closely." Later that afternoon, Hastings found himself speaking with Henrietta Bloom's colleagues, writers, publishers, and acquaintances. But one conversation stood out more than the others, with Claudia Green, the rival writer, who had been hesitant, almost too evasive. "Claudia Green is an interesting one, Poirot," Hastings remarked as he rejoined the detective. "She claims to have been close friends with Henrietta, but I have a sense she knows more than she's letting on." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Ah, Hastings, we are but at the beginning, but already the puzzle is beginning to take shape. The pieces are many, but we shall fit them together. But one thing is clear, Dr. Bloom is not the only one with secrets. There are others, and soon we shall uncover them all." Chapter 4. The unreadable, Code Poirot sat in the dimly lit study, his sharp eyes trained on the manuscript that lay open before him on the table. The symbols within its pages, scrawled in an unrecognizable script, seemed to pulse with a strange significance. Each line, each curve of the odd characters appeared to hold a secret, one that he was determined to unlock. He had seen many strange things in his time as a detective, but this was something different. The room was quiet, save for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Hastings, who had been uncharacteristically silent since their last conversation, paced back and forth, his hands shoved into his pockets. "It's uncanny, isn't it, Poirot?" Hastings said, breaking the stillness. "The way this manuscript is just sitting there, with all of its mysterious symbols. And yet it doesn't tell us anything. There's no way it could be random. It's like someone deliberately hid something inside." Poirot looked up at his companion, his expression unreadable. "Ah, Hastings, this is precisely why I am so intrigued. You see, a clue, no matter how small, no matter how seemingly insignificant, must always have a purpose. That, my friend, is the essence of our work. Everything has meaning." Hastings frowned, still unsure. But it's a code, Poirot, isn't it? And no one can read it. What use is that? Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. Ah, but the very fact that it is unreadable. This is what gives it its importance. This manuscript is a key, Hastings, but not to a door we can see. It is a key to something hidden, something we must work to uncover. Hastings looked at the manuscript again, shaking his head. I'll never understand how you do it, Poirot. It's as though you can see the meaning in everything. What if there's nothing to this? What if it's just the ravings of a woman obsessed with some new idea? Poirot stood up and walked over to the desk, his hands lightly tracing the edges of the manuscript. I do not believe that, Hastings. Henrietta Bloom was many things, but she was not a woman given to frivolous whims. No, there is purpose here, a hidden truth. Later that afternoon, Poirot had arranged for a cryptographer, one of the best in London, a man by the name of Professor Theodore Hainsworth, to examine the manuscript. Hainsworth was a stout man with wiry glasses perched at the end of his nose, his fingers twitching nervously as he adjusted the pages. He was a man who had spent most of his life deciphering obscure languages, and yet, as he glanced at the strange symbols before him, his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. This is unlike anything I've ever seen, Hainsworth muttered, almost to himself. It's not a code, at least not in any traditional sense. It's more like a language, but I cannot place it. Poirot's eyes never left the manuscript as he spoke, his voice calm but insistent. You are certain, Professor? There is no pattern here, no clue that might point to its meaning. Hainsworth frowned, his lips pressed tightly together. He tapped his fingers against the page. I've seen a great deal in my time, Mr. Poirot, but this isn't like anything I know. The symbols don't follow any known cipher, nor do they resemble any ancient or modern language I'm familiar with. It's as if they were made up entirely. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with concentration. So it is not just a matter of deciphering a code, mon ami. There is something more, something even deeper, hidden within this manuscript. Hastings, who had been standing at the door, listening, stepped into the room. You mean the symbols themselves are part of the puzzle? Exactly, Poirot replied. This manuscript is not meant to be understood immediately. Its purpose is not to speak plainly, but to confuse, to mislead. Yet within this confusion lies a solution. We must look for the patterns, Hastings, the subtle clues that even the most trained eye might miss. Hainsworth shook his head, exasperated. I'm afraid I'm of no further use, Poirot. I cannot decode it. Poirot looked at the cryptographer, his voice soft yet filled with conviction. You have done all you can, Professor. Your expertise has been invaluable, but you have shown me that this is not a code. It is something more complex. The cryptographer seemed to relax at the detective's understanding. He straightened up and nodded. Well, if I can be of any further assistance, do let me know, but for now, I think I'll leave it to you. Once the cryptographer had departed, Poirot and Hastings sat together at the desk, studying the manuscript in silence. The room seemed to grow colder, the tension thickening with every passing second. I don't understand, Poirot, Hastings said quietly, his voice a mixture of frustration and awe. If no one can read it, what's the point? How does it help us? Poirot's eyes glinted with a quiet certainty. Because it is a message, Hastings. It is meant to communicate something. The very fact that it is indecipherable is a clue in itself. He paused, looking over the manuscript again, his mind racing as he thought through the possibilities. But what if this manuscript was never meant to be read? What if it is a form of misdirection? Hastings raised an eyebrow. Misdirection? You mean it's a decoy? To keep us from looking at something else? Poirot smiled thinly. Precisely. This book, this code, it is not the true clue. It is a diversion. The question is, what does it divert us from? Hastings glanced at the manuscript once more, his mind trying to make sense of Poirot's reasoning. So, you're saying this manuscript is deliberately hiding something? Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, and perhaps its greatest secret lies not within the symbols themselves, but in the people around it, the ones who have seen it, who have touched it, who have been privy to its secrets. As Poirot continued to mull over the manuscript, Hastings returned to the task of gathering information about Henrietta's relationships. He spent the next several hours speaking to people who had been close to the writer, searching for any connection, any hint of motive that might point to a suspect. It was during one of these conversations that he spoke with a young editor at Henrietta's publishing house, a man named Jonathan Stone. Stone was quiet, reserved, and had worked closely with Henrietta on her most recent project. He was in his late 20s, with sharp features and a calculating expression. He had a somewhat distant air about him, as if always lost in thought. She was, a difficult person to work with, Stone said, his voice low as he sipped his drink. Henrietta, I mean. Brilliant, yes, but incredibly secretive. She insisted that I read through everything before it went to print. She had a strict, almost obsessive way of working. Nothing was left to chance. Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. And did you ever get to see her manuscript, the one that was found on her desk? Stone hesitated, his eyes darting to the side before meeting Hastings' gaze. No, I didn't. But I do know one thing. Henrietta was very protective of it. She didn't let anyone near it, not even me. Hastings' eyes narrowed, a suspicion forming. Why do you say that? Did she seem worried about something? Stone shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Worried? No, not exactly. But she was different near the end. There was something frantic in her eyes, as though she had discovered something important. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I think she was hiding something. Hastings studied Stone closely, his instincts telling him that this man knew more than he was letting on. But just as he was about to press further, the door to the office opened, and Poirot stepped inside. Ah, Hastings, mon ami, Poirot said, his voice rich with quiet intensity. I have been thinking, the manuscript is a message, yes, but it is also a distraction. The truth, I believe, lies elsewhere. Stone looked at Poirot, startled by his sudden appearance. Poirot's gaze, however, was already fixed on him. I shall have to speak with you soon, Monsieur Stone, Poirot added, his voice colder now. For you may know more than you are willing to admit. Chapter 5. The publisher's secrets. Poirot stood in the dimly lit hallway of the publisher's office, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the crisp envelope he had just received. It was from Charles Rimmer, the man behind the successful publishing house that had brought Henrietta Bloom's work to the masses. And yet something about the publisher didn't sit right with Poirot. Rimmer had been a fixture in the literary world for years, business-minded, composed, with a reputation for shrewd decision-making. But as Poirot had quickly discovered, appearances often deceived. There was more to this case than mere business dealings, and Rimmer's reactions were not as straightforward as they seemed. As they were led into Rimmer's office, Poirot couldn't help but observe the sharp lines of tension that cut through the man's features, the way his eyes darted toward the window as if seeking escape. Yet he had been sitting behind his polished desk moments earlier when Poirot arrived, every inch the calm businessman. Now he was standing, pacing with an unease that Poirot did not fail to notice. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, you have come," Rimmer said, his voice tight but smooth. "What can I do for you?" Poirot took a step forward, his gaze steady and sharp. "You know, Monsieur Rimmer, this is not an ordinary case, and you are not an ordinary publisher. It is my belief that you may know far more than you are letting on about this situation. Let us sit and discuss it." Hastings, ever the observer, moved to sit quietly beside Poirot, but Rimmer remained standing, his fingers twitching slightly by his side. Poirot's eyes followed the movement, noting the man's agitated behavior. "Of course," Rimmer replied, though his voice faltered ever so slightly. He straightened, clearly trying to regain control, and took a slow breath. Henrietta was a remarkable woman. She and I had worked together for years. This is a dreadful, dreadful thing. You must know I trusted her, you know." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Ah, yes, and yet you are not merely her publisher, are you? You were in fact one of the last people to see her, no?" Rimmer's gaze momentarily faltered, his eyes quickly darting away, and Poirot observed it with satisfaction. The man was hiding something. It wasn't in the words he spoke, which were full of polished sadness, but in his every motion. It was in the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the twitching of his fingers. "Of course," Rimmer said, recovering quickly, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "We spoke just a day before her death. She had finished the manuscript, well, mostly, and was eager to finalize the details. She was excited, I believe, but, yes, a little distant. She seemed preoccupied, perhaps with something that was troubling her." His tone dipped slightly, as though he were trying to keep his words measured. Poirot's gaze softened as he spoke. "Troubled, you say? A woman of such talent, such brilliance, troubled by what, do you think?" Rimmer's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment Poirot saw the fleeting glimpse of something like guilt, something that could not easily be disguised. "It's hard to say. Henrietta wasn't one to share her problems openly, but, well, she had been working on that manuscript for quite some time, and I had always noticed she was particularly protective of it. It was as though she believed it held some deeper meaning, but that was normal for her, wasn't it?" Poirot considered the man for a moment before replying, his voice low and deliberate. "Normal for her, perhaps, monsieur, but not normal for everyone, I believe. For what reason, would you say, did she trust you with the manuscript?" "You must." "No, she was not known for allowing many to see it before it was finished." Rimmer's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. I've been with her career from the beginning. She trusted me. We had a good working relationship, but I am afraid I cannot offer you anything more substantial than that. You have to understand, Poirot, that I am a businessman. I work with words, with contracts, with deadlines. I am not involved in the personal life of my authors. I only cared for her success. Poirot's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Ah, but that is where you make a mistake, monsieur, because the key to this murder, as I see it, lies not in business or words alone, but in those very personal connections. And I must ask, was there anyone else with whom she had personal relations that might cause trouble?" Rimmer's expression froze. His gaze shifted uneasily from the floor to the window, but he said nothing for a long moment, as though weighing his words carefully. "I don't know," Rimmer replied finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps, but I can't say who." Poirot leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you mind if I ask about the last meeting you had with her? You mentioned that you spoke just a day before her death. What was discussed? What was her mood like? Rimmer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mouth tightening as he hesitated. I told her the manuscript would be ready to go to print. We'd ironed out the final details. She seemed pleased, but there was something in her eyes. Something I can't place. I don't think she wanted it to be finished, not really. Poirot's gaze never wavered. What do you mean, not really, monsieur? Rimmer hesitated again, then sighed, as if resigning himself to something. Henrietta had always been a perfectionist. She'd go over every word, every sentence, until it was just right. But there was something more to it, a sense of urgency in her, if you know what I mean. I had never seen her like that before. She was almost desperate to finish it. A flicker of something crossed Poirot's face. Ah, desperate, you say? His fingers pressed together, a habit when something piqued his curiosity. And why do you think that was, monsieur? Rimmer's eyes darted to the door, his voice lowering even more. I think she was afraid. Afraid of something. In that manuscript, something that might change everything. But you mustn't ask me what, Poirot. I really don't know. Poirot rose from his chair, and for a moment he simply stood there, gazing at Rimmer. The publisher was an enigma, his demeanour smooth, but his actions betrayed him. His inability to meet Poirot's eye, the quick glances toward the door, and his tense hands were all signs of someone hiding something more than just the fear of business failure. There was more at play here. Ah, Monsieur Rimmer, Poirot said softly, his voice rich with an unspoken certainty. You are indeed a man of business, but I do not believe your worry lies in your work alone. There is something deeper at play, and I intend to find it. Rimmer's face paled slightly, and for a brief moment Poirot could see the mask crack. But just as quickly he regained his composure, nodding stiffly. I assure you, Poirot, if there's anything I can do to assist you, you need only ask. Poirot smiled faintly, the kind of smile that suggested he had already seen through the surface. As Poirot and Hastings left Rimmer's office, Poirot's mind was racing, sorting through the contradictions he had just heard. There was something strange about Rimmer's account, something that didn't add up. The publisher's reluctance to speak about the manuscript, his conflicting statements about the last meeting, every small detail seemed to lead to a single conclusion. I think, mon ami, Poirot said, his voice low, we are getting closer to the truth, but there is still much that remains hidden. Hastings turned to him, his brow furrowed in thought. Do you think Rimmer knows something? Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. I do not think he is the only one hiding something. But the manuscript, mon ami, that holds the answer. The symbols are a distraction. The real secret lies somewhere deeper, and I intend to find it. Chapter 6. The Friend's Testimony. The air was thick with the scent of autumn as Poirot and Hastings approached the modest but charming house of Alice Pendleton. The residence, tucked away on the outskirts of London, was secluded, quiet, as if it held secrets beneath its quiet facade. Alice Pendleton, Henrietta Bloom's closest friend, had always been a woman of introverted nature. Her reclusiveness had only increased in recent years, particularly after Henrietta's sudden rise to fame. The door was opened by a tall, thin woman with pale features. Her soft, dark eyes regarded them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Alice Pendleton was an enigma, a woman whose silence spoke volumes. Her demeanour was cool and collected, but there was a palpable tension in her presence, something guarded and unwilling to share too easily. "Come in, Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," Alice said, her voice almost a whisper, but warm. She stepped aside, allowing them entry. "I wasn't expecting you so soon, but I understand why you are here." Poirot smiled gently, his eyes taking in the serene, almost sombre surroundings. The room was filled with books, and the soft, golden light of the afternoon filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words, of memories not yet released. "Madame Pendleton, it is good of you to receive us."
"You knew Henrietta Bloom very well, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot began, his voice warm but keenly observant. Alice nodded, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I did. We were friends for many years. She was more like a sister to me than anything else." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, but she quickly regained her composure. "Your grief, it must be immense," Poirot said softly, his eyes narrowing. He had no doubt that the loss of her friend weighed heavily on Alice, but there was something in her expression that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "Yes, it is," Alice replied, though her voice was firm.
"But that is not why you are here, is it, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot raised an eyebrow, his hands folded together. "No, it is not. I would like to ask you about Henrietta's recent behavior. You mentioned that she was not herself in the weeks leading up to her death." Alice hesitated, glancing away. She took a long breath as though preparing herself. Henrietta! She was obsessed with that manuscript, her work. It consumed her entirely. I thought it was just her usual passion for writing, but it became something else, something darker. She would stay up all night, scribbling furiously. Sometimes she wouldn't even speak to me for days. I didn't understand it at first, but then there was the deal with Charles Rimmer. "Ah, Rimmer," Hastings interjected, his voice carrying the usual skepticism that had built after their
"Meeting with the publisher."
"Tell me, Miss Pendleton, did you notice any change in Henrietta's attitude toward Rimmer? It seemed that she was quite driven by the prospect of publication." Alice's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze darting toward the window before returning to Poirot. Henrietta had always been ambitious, but after she agreed to the publishing deal with Rimmer, things changed. She received letters, strange letters. I never saw them, but she mentioned them to me a few times. They seemed to frighten her. Poirot's interest peaked, and his eyes locked onto hers. "Letters? Strange, you say? What were these letters about?" Alice's face darkened. "Henrietta wouldn't tell me the details, but she did mention one thing several times. Something about unfinished business, and how someone had claimed they would make her pay for what she had done. She said it was from someone she had wronged, but she wouldn't say who. I thought it was just stress from the manuscript, but now I wonder, mon nom?"
"Dieu," Poirot muttered under his breath, his fingers tapping the edge of his chin. He looked at Hastings, his eyes sharp. "This is most curious. The letters, they seem to hold the key to something, yes?"
Alice nodded. "I agree. She was unsettled by them, but never let on what they said. She burned them all, but I think she might have kept one." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing in thought. "You believe she kept one?"
"Of the letters? Do you know where it is now, Madame Pendleton?" Alice shifted uncomfortably, her hands wringing together in her lap.
"I don't know. She was always so secretive about it. I never understood why she was so afraid. But I do know that she had been avoiding her family. She cut ties with them, stopped responding to their letters and calls. It was as if she was trying to sever any ties to her past. That too seemed strange to me. Poirot's gaze darkened. "You believe this has something to do with her murder?" Alice's voice dropped to a whisper, as though she feared even the walls might hear her words.
"I'm not sure, but she was different. The Henrietta I knew would never have done that. She would never have shut people out like that. And after she received those letters, she became, I don't know, like she was running from something." Poirot's
Brow furrowed as he processed the information. A woman running from something, cutting off family, and receiving cryptic letters about unfinished business. It wasn't a coincidence. Henrietta Bloom had been entangled in something far deeper than a simple manuscript, and the murder was the result of something more personal, more sinister. "Tell me, Alice," Poirot asked, his voice taking on a softer, more deliberate tone, "do you think these letters could have been a clue, something that might have pointed to her killer?" Alice hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't know. But I found something yesterday," she said suddenly, her voice quivering with nervousness. "I found a letter in her desk. It was one she had received, and it was different from the others. The handwriting was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was dated just a week before her death." Poirot's interest sharpened. "You have it with you?" Alice nodded slowly, standing from her chair and crossing the room to a small wooden desk by the window. She pulled open a drawer and retrieved a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but still legible. Alice handed it to Poirot with trembling hands. Poirot opened the letter carefully, his eyes scanning the words. His face remained impassive as he read, but his mind raced. The letter was brief, but the message was chilling. "The time has come, Henrietta. You can run, but you cannot hide. I will make you pay for what you did. You know what I mean. Your past is catching up with you." Poirot set the letter down on the desk, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the paper. This is the key. Yes, this letter speaks of something buried long ago. But what is this past that the writer refers to? He stood up, his mind already piecing together fragments. Monsieur Rimmer, the strange behavior of Henrietta, her secretive attitude, the letter. There is a story here, hidden beneath the surface. Hastings looked up at him, puzzled. "But how does it all fit together? Who could have sent this letter?" Poirot turned slowly to face Alice, his eyes narrowing. "That is what I must discover. But one thing is certain. The letter is not a mere coincidence. It is a clue, and I will follow it wherever it leads." Chapter 7. The Rival's Motive. The meeting with Claudia Green took place at a small, elegant flat in the heart of London. Despite the grandeur of the building, the apartment inside was stark and meticulously ordered, almost clinical in its precision. It was a fitting reflection of the woman who inhabited it, cold, calculated, and seemingly uninterested in matters beyond herself. As Poirot and Hastings stepped across the threshold, they were met by the faint, unpleasant scent of expensive perfume mixed with something more unsettling, an air of artificial calmness that hung around Claudia like a veil. She was seated on a plush armchair, a cup of tea in hand, as if the world had not just been shattered by the murder of her former friend. Her demeanour was composed, even too composed, and she greeted them with a polite nod, her eyes slightly narrowed, as though appraising them with suspicion. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, her voice smooth, with just a hint of disdain. "I assume you are here to discuss Henrietta's death." To be frank, I find it all rather tiresome. A tragic incident, of course, but I fail to see how my involvement is of interest. Poirot studied her intently. The sharpness of her features, her neatly combed auburn hair, and the way she sat with perfect poise all suggested a woman who was accustomed to control of her surroundings and the people around her. But there was something in her eyes, something calculating that hinted at deeper currents beneath her cold exterior. "Ah, Madame Green," Poirot began, his voice as smooth and measured as hers. "I believe you are mistaken. We are all involved in the web of this mystery, are we not? Henrietta Bloom was an important figure, a successful author. Her death, it affects all those who knew her, in one way or another." Claudia's lips curled into a thin smile. "I suppose you're right, but I fail to see what this has to do with me. Henrietta and I were not the best of friends, but I hardly wish to discuss her demise as if it were some great tragedy. She had her successes, and I had mine." Poirot tilted his head slightly, narrowing his eyes. "Ah, so there was competition between you?" he asked softly, his gaze never leaving hers. Claudia's eyes flickered for a moment, an almost imperceptible twitch of irritation before she masked it once more. Competition? Henrietta was always the darling of the literary world, wasn't she? All the attention, all the praise. It became tiresome after a while. I did try to reason with her. No. I suggested she pull the book, her latest manuscript, from publication. I told her it would be a disaster. But Henrietta, in her usual way, refused to listen. Poirot's gaze sharpened, and he leaned forward slightly. "She rejected your advice?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with an undercurrent of curiosity. Claudia's eyes hardened as she set her cup down on the table, the delicate porcelain clinking against the surface. Of course she did. Henrietta was always so sure of herself, so certain that the world owed her something, but she had become reckless. I warned her. I truly did. That manuscript, it was her undoing. And you felt that she deserved to be overshadowed by someone else? Poirot pressed, his voice gentle but probing. That your work, perhaps, was deserving of the attention she received? Claudia paused as if weighing her response carefully. I didn't want Henrietta to fail. No, but I wanted her to see sense. She was headed for a fall, and I simply wanted to spare her the embarrassment. Her success had become, well, it had begun to overshadow my own. I had a career too, after all. I did not want to be remembered only as her rival. Poirot observed her with the quiet intensity that had so often unravelled the most tightly held secrets. There was something off about her, the indifference, the detachment. No grief, no real sense of loss. It didn't fit with what one would expect from a friend, even a distant one. Could it be jealousy? Yes, perhaps. But was it enough to drive her to murder? Tell me, Madame Green, Poirot asked, his eyes never leaving her face. Where were you on the night of Henrietta's death? Claudia's posture stiffened, but only for a moment. Her response came swiftly, too swiftly. I was at home.
Alone. I have no alibi, if that's what you mean, but I see no reason why I would need one. I was in the company of my own thoughts. I had no reason to harm Henrietta.
Hastings, who had been standing in the corner of the room, shifted uncomfortably. But your alibi, it is quite thin, isn't it, Miss Green? Just your word, nothing more? Claudia's lips parted in a smile that was more of a sneer. If you want to question my whereabouts further, I suggest you speak to my neighbours. They'll confirm I was in all evening. But I suppose you will find that my absence has no bearing on the matter.
I had no reason to kill Henrietta. Quite the opposite, in fact. She was irritating at times, but she was also useful. Her book would have sold more than mine, after all. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressed together in a
steeple. Ah, that, Madame Green, is where I believe you are mistaken. There is a deeper reason why someone might wish harm to Henrietta Bloom. It is not only envy, is it? There is something more, something hidden behind your cold exterior. Claudia's eyes flickered briefly before she regained control, her expression once again masked by an impenetrable calm. You're reading too much into it, Monsieur Poirot. I had nothing to do with Henrietta's death. My only concern was for the future of my career. If you truly wish to solve her murder, you should look to those closer to her family, to her publisher. Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. Perhaps you are right, Madame Green. But let us not dismiss the possibility that it was someone who knew Henrietta well, someone with more to gain from her death than simply a publisher's contract or literary fame. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Claudia's expression remained unreadable, though a flicker of something, a shadow of doubt, crossed her face for the briefest moment. Poirot stood, his movements deliberate and controlled. Thank you for your time, Madame Green. We will not trouble you any further today, but remember this. I am very good at uncovering truths that others wish to keep hidden. As they made their way to the door, Poirot turned to Hastings, his voice quiet. There is something amiss about her, Hastings. She is not as indifferent as she pretends to be. The jealousy, the bitterness, it is all too easy. There is something deeper here, a motive we have yet to uncover. Hastings gave a frustrated sigh. Do you think she's our murderer? Poirot paused for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. I do not know yet, mon ami, but she is a piece of the puzzle and I will keep my eyes on her. There is something off about her, and I will find the truth. Chapter 8. The book's true. Purpose Poirot sat in his study, the manuscript spread before him on the desk. The symbols, previously regarded as indecipherable, were now arranged in neat rows. Each one was a variation of the same shape, some larger, others smaller, some with intricate loops, others with sharp angles. To an untrained eye, they would appear as nothing more than a random assortment of abstract patterns. But to Poirot, each symbol was a clue, a piece of a puzzle that he was now beginning to see more clearly. Mon ami, you are becoming obsessed, Hastings remarked from his armchair, watching Poirot's intense concentration. You've spent hours on this already. Do you really think these symbols hold the key to Henrietta's murder? Poirot looked up, his eyes gleaming with a quiet certainty. Ah, Hastings, it is always the smallest detail that reveals the greatest truths. You see, these symbols are not mere decorations, not a traditional code. They are, in fact, something far more significant. Hastings raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. Then what are they? Patterns, Poirot replied with a small smile, pleased to have piqued his friend's curiosity. Patterns that represent the events of Henrietta's life. Each symbol, placed in its rightful order, forms a picture, one that mirrors her personal history. It is as if the book itself is a confession, a record of secrets she never intended to keep hidden. He reached for a small notebook, scribbling down the sequence of symbols as they appeared in the manuscript. As he placed them in order, the connections between the symbols began to form an intricate web of events. They told a story, not of fiction, but of real moments in Henrietta's life, moments she had somehow hidden beneath the surface of her published works. The cryptic symbols weren't meant to tell a tale in the traditional sense. They were meant to expose something else entirely. Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity overtaking his skepticism. "So you're telling me these symbols are not just part of the plot of her book, but they're revealing her personal life. What could she have been trying to hide?" Poirot tapped the page thoughtfully. "The manuscript is not just a work of fiction, mon ami. It is a mirror, a reflection of Henrietta's past, a past filled with things she wished to bury. It is as if, in writing this book, she had begun to confess something she could not say aloud, but chose to encode in this cryptic form." A chill ran through the room, as though the shadows in the corners had deepened. Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing. The patterns were becoming clearer now. He could see the subtle connections, the small but undeniable clues. The manuscript was more than a literary work. It was a map of secrets, a roadmap that led to something buried deep within Henrietta's life. But what? Hastings watched Poirot's hand move across the page, tracking the symbols as though they were pieces of a puzzle. "You think she was trying to expose someone's secret, don't you?" he asked. Poirot nodded slowly, as though confirming a thought that had only just fully formed in his mind. "Yes, Hastings, but whose secret? That is the question. The book,
If it is what I believe it to be, is a confessional, and I suspect it is not only Henrietta's secrets that it holds." The thought sent a ripple through Poirot's mind.
what if Henrietta had written this manuscript not as a work of fiction, but as an act of vengeance, a way of unmasking those who had wronged her? The patterns, he realized, could represent specific events, perhaps moments of betrayal, of conflict. Could one of these events be connected to her murder? He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The manuscript had to be connected to Henrietta's death. There was no other explanation. It was too deliberate, too carefully constructed to be anything but a key. But how could a book, a set of symbols, lead them to the murderer? Hastings shifted in his chair, his tone cautious. "But Poirot, what about the others? We've questioned her husband, her publisher, her best friend. Each of them seems to have a motive, and yet none of them fit perfectly into this puzzle. Could it be someone else? Someone we haven't considered yet?" Poirot's expression softened, and he gave a small but knowing smile. "Ah, Hastings, that is the beauty of this case. It is always the people we overlook who hold the most crucial pieces of the puzzle. You are right, of course, but let us not jump ahead of ourselves." Poirot returned to the manuscript, his fingers brushing lightly over the symbols. "No, this book is not simply a story. It is a map of Henrietta's life, a cryptic diary, and if we follow it closely enough, it will lead us to the truth." Suddenly Poirot froze, his gaze locking on one particular symbol, a circle with jagged lines emanating from it, almost like the rays of a sun. He had seen this symbol before. It was familiar, but he couldn't place where. His heart quickened as the connection clicked into place. "The letters," he murmured, almost to himself. Of course. Hastings, who had been watching Poirot with increasing impatience, leaned forward. "What is it? What's the significance of the symbol?" Poirot's mind was racing now. "It is the symbol that appeared in the letters Henrietta received. The cryptic letters, the ones Alice Pendleton mentioned, the same jagged circle." Hastings was quick to catch on. "But why would Henrietta be receiving letters with the same symbol, and from whom?" Poirot rose abruptly, a sudden energy surging through him. "That is what we must find out." The letters, they were not just random threats, Hastings. They were a message, a warning. Someone was trying to keep Henrietta from revealing the truth. He turned toward the door, his mind already moving toward the next step of the investigation. We must find those letters, and when we do, we will know who wanted Henrietta dead and why. Hastings stood up as well, eager to follow Poirot's
lead. But how do we find the letters, Poirot? They could be anywhere.
Poirot paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. We will start with Alice Pendleton. She may know more than she has let on. The two men made their way out of the study, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Poirot's thoughts were sharp and clear now, the path forward illuminated by the faint glow of understanding. The manuscript, the symbols, the letters, it was all connected, and soon, very soon, the truth would be revealed. Chapter 9. The hidden motives. Poirot sat alone in the drawing-room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. His mind was sharp, focused, but the pieces of the puzzle still didn't quite fit together. The manuscript had revealed more than he had anticipated, yet the cryptic symbols had not provided the full answer. He understood now that Henrietta had been trying to expose something deeply hidden. But what? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the door opening. Captain Hastings entered, his expression troubled. "Poirot, I've spoken to Alice Pendleton again," Hastings said, closing the door quietly behind him. "There's something she didn't mention earlier, something quite significant." Poirot looked up with a sharpness that betrayed his earlier calm. "And what is this something, mon ami?" Hastings stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. Henrietta was planning to leave her husband. I spoke with some of her acquaintances. It seems there was talk of a separation, of her moving out, and not just any separation. She had already begun the process of making arrangements. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath
his chin. So it was not just a betrayal of her trust then, Hastings. No, this was a betrayal of a far more personal nature. Henrietta had been planning to sever herself from the ties that bound her to Dr. Edmund Bloom, her husband. What a curious
development. Hastings shifted, clearly unsure of where this new information led. But why? Henrietta seemed so fond of him when I spoke to her. They didn't seem like a couple in trouble. Could it be just about money, Poirot? Poirot shook his head slowly. No, I do not believe it was just money. There is more at play here, something deeper, something hidden within the marriage. The debt to Rimmer, the publisher, suggests that Henrietta's financial situation was precarious, but that does not explain the rift between her and Dr. Bloom. No, Hastings, I suspect there was a deeper betrayal, something that came to light too late, something Henrietta could no longer ignore. Hastings frowned. But what of the manuscript? It's all too confusing. It seems to be connected to her personal life in a way we didn't realize.
Exactly, Poirot said, his voice low and deliberate. The manuscript, it is not merely a work of fiction. It is her confession, her attempt to right some wrong she could not bear. It is her message, Hastings, and yet it is a message laced
with confusion. Why? He paused, his gaze far away as he sifted through the pieces in his mind. Suddenly Poirot stood up, his eyes alight with realization. There is a truth we have yet to face. The manuscript, Henrietta's book, was never meant to be just a story. No, it was a veiled accusation. Hastings blinked, trying to keep up with Poirot's rapid train of thought. An accusation? But of
What? Poirot turned sharply, as if the answer had been right before him all along. Of betrayal.
Henrietta's book, Mon Ami, was designed to expose a betrayal within her inner circle of those who were closest to her. It was a plea for justice, one that would have caused scandal, no doubt. But who could she have been accusing? His eyes flitted to the manuscript once more, the pages now seeming more ominous than ever. It is not enough to say she was betrayed. Who betrayed her and why? Was it Dr. Bloom? Was it Rimmer? Or perhaps someone else entirely? Hastings leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. But what makes you so sure it was meant to expose someone? What in the manuscript gave you that idea? Poirot looked at him, his expression serene yet determined. The symbols, Hastings, the patterns, they are not merely decorative, they mirror events in Henrietta's life. Each one corresponds to a specific moment, a turning point in her relationships, and one of those moments must be the betrayal. Hastings nodded slowly, trying to process it all. But who would want to kill Henrietta over a betrayal? Couldn't she have just exposed the truth without the need for murder? That is where we
Must delve deeper, Poirot replied softly. Perhaps, Hastings, someone felt their life, perhaps even their reputation, was at risk of being destroyed. The manuscript was not just an act of revelation, it was an act of exposure, one that would
have left the guilty party no place to hide. A knock on the door interrupted them, and Poirot turned to face it, his expression unchanged. Alice Pendleton entered the room, her face pale, her eyes red from what seemed like sleepless nights. She closed the door behind her and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Poirot," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've come to tell you something. Something Henrietta told me, only I didn't think it mattered at the time." Poirot motioned for her to sit. "Please, Mademoiselle Pendleton, you must tell me. Every detail is important." She took a deep breath and sat down, wringing her hands nervously. Henrietta had received several letters in the weeks before her death. At first, I thought they were just from fans, perhaps even some critical letters, but there was one letter, Poirot, one that stood out. It came just days before her death, and she said it was from someone close to her, someone she had trusted. She paused, eyes brimming with anxiety. Henrietta said the letter contained a threat, and that the person had warned her to stop writing, the book to stop exposing what she had planned to reveal. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wonder if it was that very letter that led to her death. Poirot's gaze narrowed, his mind working furiously to connect the dots. "You are certain this letter came just days before her death?" he asked, his voice a careful whisper. Alice nodded. "Yes, it was the last letter she received before she was killed. She told me she was going to confront the person." "Who wrote it?" A strange silence settled over the room as the weight of Alice's words sank in. Poirot's mind raced, but the pieces were still not fully in place. Yet one thing was clear. Henrietta had been attempting to confront someone who had been part of her circle, someone she had trusted deeply. "This letter?" Poirot murmured, more to himself than to Alice. "It is the key, Hastings. If we can find this letter, we will know who had the most to lose from Henrietta's exposure." Alice looked at Poirot, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But she didn't tell me who sent it." She only said it was someone close to her. Someone who had betrayed her? Poirot stood, his face grim. Then we must find that letter. And we must find who sent it, for that person, I believe, holds the answer to this murder. As Alice stood to leave, she glanced back at Poirot with a faint flicker.
Of hope. You'll find the truth, won't you?
Poirot nodded, his voice low but resolute. I will, Mademoiselle Pendleton, and when I do, everything will become clear. Alice exited the room, leaving Poirot and Hastings alone once more. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but there was no warmth in the room now. Poirot was consumed by the thought of the letter. Whoever had sent it was at the heart of this mystery, and with that letter, Poirot was sure he would uncover the truth at last. Chapter 10. False Leads and Dead Ends. Poirot sat at his desk, the clutter of papers and notes spread out before him. Each piece seemed to fit together in some way, yet the full picture remained maddeningly elusive. The manuscript, the mysterious letter, the betrayed trust, each clue seemed to point in a dozen different directions, but not a single one led him to the culprit. Hastings had gone off to speak with the local constable, and Poirot was left alone with his thoughts. He had followed every lead, each one more frustrating than the last. The idea that Henrietta's death might have been the result of a botched robbery had seemed promising at first. A burglary gone wrong, only nothing of value had been taken. The safe in Henrietta's study was untouched, as was the jewellery she kept locked away. That theory had collapsed almost immediately. Then there was the suggestion of a lover's quarrel, another possibility raised by Alice Pendleton herself. She had admitted, in a moment of vulnerability, that Henrietta had once confided in her about an affair, but when Poirot had probed further, the details were murky at best. No lover had come forward, and Alice had been unable to identify anyone. Who could have been involved in such a confrontation? Another dead end. Finally, there was the theory of a hired killer. Some dark, shadowy figure employed to silence Henrietta for reasons unknown. Yet the more Poirot thought about it, the less. It made sense. No hired gun would leave such an elaborate personal clue behind as a manuscript filled with cryptic symbols. The killer had intended something far more intricate, something tied directly to Henrietta's life. And so, here he sat, staring at the collection of dead ends that seemed to mock him. Each possibility, carefully considered, had disintegrated under scrutiny. Yet Poirot refused to allow himself the luxury of frustration. His mind, sharp and relentless, would find the way forward. He had seen the complexity of human nature too many times to believe that any answer was too elusive. He was jolted from his thoughts by the sound of footsteps approaching. Hastings entered, his brow furrowed in frustration. "Nothing," he said, flatly, lowering himself into the chair opposite Poirot. The constable's investigation turned up nothing new. Every lead seems to be a false one. We're no closer to finding the truth. Poirot smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Ah, Hastings, this is precisely why we must be patient. The truth will emerge, it always does, though it sometimes takes longer than we would wish." Hastings let out a deep sigh. "I suppose so, but it's hard to stay hopeful when nothing is adding up. What about the publisher, Charles Rimmer? You seemed to suspect him at one point." Poirot leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Rimmer? Yes, he was a prime suspect for a time. His conflicting statements about his meeting with Henrietta, his obvious concern for his business interests. These were troubling, certainly. But the more I observe him, the more I suspect that he may not have the motive we once thought." "Meaning?" Hastings asked. leaning forward. Meaning, Rimmer is no fool, Poirot said thoughtfully. He's a businessman, not a murderer. He knows the value of reputation, and it would be more to his advantage to distance himself from Henrietta's death than to be involved in it. He could have simply severed ties with her if he thought she was a threat to his business. No, he's not our man. Hastings was silent for a moment, clearly not ready to accept that conclusion. So, who does that leave us with, Dr. Bloom? Alice? Poirot's gaze flicked momentarily to the manuscript, now open on the desk before him. He studied it intently, as though the answer might be written in its symbols. Perhaps. Dr. Bloom, for all his outward distress, remains an enigma. His marriage to Henrietta seems strained, but that alone does not constitute a motive for murder. It is the nature of their relationship that interests me. But I do not believe he is the murderer, Hastings. He is too predictable. What about Alice, then? Hastings asked. Could she have killed Henrietta to protect her own secrets? Poirot's lips quirked into a brief smile. Ah, Hastings, Alice Pendleton is a woman of complexity, but I find it hard to believe that she would go so far as to kill her best friend, even if there were secrets between them. No, her role is more that of a witness, not a perpetrator. Hastings rubbed his chin thoughtfully. So we're back to square one, aren't we? No solid leads, no suspects who fit the bill. But you keep saying that the truth will come out. What are we missing, Poirot? Poirot looked at him, his eyes gleaming with a quiet certainty. We are missing the key, mon ami, the missing piece that ties everything together. We have followed many paths, but none have led us to the truth. What we need is to stop looking for what is obvious and start looking for what is hidden. Hastings blinked in confusion. Hidden? But what's hidden, Poirot? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the manuscript and began flipping through the pages once more. The cryptic symbols danced before his eyes, their meaning still just out of reach. Yet he could feel something stirring within him, a connection, a link between these symbols and the deeper mysteries that surrounded Henrietta's life and death. His gaze stopped on a particular page.
A series of symbols caught his attention. They were out of place, not in the usual pattern that had begun to emerge in the manuscript. It was as though they were intentionally separated, isolated from the rest. Poirot's heart gave an almost imperceptible jolt. Hastings, Poirot said, his voice quiet but urgent. Look here. Hastings leaned over, his eyes scanning the page.
What is it, Poirot? Poirot tapped the symbols with a finger. These symbols, they are different, out of sequence. They do not fit with the rest of the pattern. Hastings frowned, still not understanding. What does that mean? Poirot's eyes gleamed. It means that Henrietta was trying to tell us something. These symbols are not part of her confession, they are part of her final message. The key to the mystery, Hastings, lies in what is hidden within the manuscript itself. Hastings looked at him, slowly beginning to understand. You think Henrietta left us a clue here, in the manuscript? Precisely, Poirot said, nodding. She knew something was going to happen, she knew her life was in danger, and she encoded the truth in these symbols to be deciphered only after her death. Hastings shook his head in amazement. And you think you can decipher it, Poirot? Poirot gave a small, confident smile. I am confident, Hastings, that Henrietta's final message is not so elusive as it appears. We are on the verge of uncovering the truth. We must simply look in the right direction. A sense of anticipation filled the room, as Poirot leaned closer to the manuscript, his fingers tracing the unusual symbols. The answers were close now, closer than ever. But as Poirot studied the page, a shadow seemed to fall across the room. Something, or someone, was watching them. And just as Poirot's mind began to form the first, crucial connection, the door to the study creaked open again. The puzzle was not yet solved. Chapter 11. A breakthrough in the Code Poirot had hardly finished, speaking when the door to the study creaked open. Both he and Hastings turned instinctively to the entrance, their eyes narrowing with curiosity. A figure stepped into the room, a tall, imposing man with a stiff, deliberate gait. It was Charles Rimmer. The publisher's face was drawn, his expression taut, as though the weight of the world rested upon his shoulders. His gaze flicked briefly to the manuscript on the table before meeting Poirot's eyes. The tension in the air was palpable. "Poirot," Rimmer began, his voice rough, as though he had been carrying a heavy burden for some time. "I must speak with you. There are things—"
"You don't understand."
"Things that I—" He faltered, his usual self-assured manner slipping for a moment. Poirot did not immediately respond. Instead, he regarded the publisher with the same calm precision that had guided him throughout the investigation. He could sense that Rimmer was about to reveal something important, something that might finally put the pieces of the puzzle together. "Come in, Monsieur Rimmer," Poirot said, softly, his voice a study in encouragement. "You are welcome to share your thoughts, but I warn you, they may not be what you expect." Rimmer hesitated for only a second before stepping forward and lowering himself into the chair across from Poirot. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, his hands clasped tightly together as though holding on to a fragile secret. Finally, he spoke again, though this time his voice was tinged with both frustration and fear. "I don't know how to begin," he muttered. "But Henrietta, she was closer to the truth than anyone realized. And He paused, swallowing hard, as if the words were stuck in his throat. "I should have told you sooner, but I thought it would be better to wait until you uncovered everything on your own." Poirot remained silent, watching Rimmer closely. He was a man of contradictions. His usual arrogance had been replaced by something far more vulnerable. His nervousness, however, was not enough to mask the palpable guilt in his voice. "What is it that Henrietta knew?" Hastings asked, unable to hold back his curiosity. Rimmer's eyes flicked to the manuscript, then back to Poirot. His mouth tightened. "She discovered something that threatened all of us. It wasn't just the book, you see. It was about money, about a financial arrangement that had been manipulated." "Go on," Poirot said, leaning forward slightly. Rimmer's hands began to tremble, and he quickly clasped them together to steady himself. "Henrietta was more than just an author to me. She was an investment. She had a contract to publish her book, yes, but there was something more, something I hadn't planned for. Her success, it brought in more than just royalties. She had access to certain assets, real estate, family investments, that I had a hand in managing." He paused, eyes flickering nervously. But Henrietta had started asking questions. She wanted to know more about her finances, about where the money was really going. It wasn't just the book she was investigating. It was her entire life, her family's business dealings, her inheritance. She was on the brink of exposing
"A scam." Poirot's mind shifted gears, connecting the dots in a flash. Henrietta had been cleverer than anyone had realized.
The manuscript, then, had not only been a confession, but a method of exposing the truth, something she had sensed might be too dangerous for her to confront directly. "A scam, you say?" Poirot asked, his voice laced with quiet interest. And
who exactly was involved in this deception? Rimmer looked away, as if the answer weighed too heavily on him. But Poirot was persistent.
I believe, Monsieur Rimmer, that the person who would benefit the most from Henrietta's silence is not the man she loved, or even the woman who envied her success. No, it is someone much closer to her, someone who stands to lose far more than they could afford. Rimmer's eyes widened, but he did not speak. Instead, he placed his hands over his face, as if in shame. Poirot's gaze flicked toward Hastings. I have long suspected that the true motive was not personal, but financial. Henrietta was unraveling a thread that threatened more than just her reputation. It threatened everything. Hastings, still not entirely following, glanced between Poirot and Rimmer. So you're saying someone in Henrietta's family was involved?
In a financial scam? Someone close to her, like her husband?
Poirot smiled knowingly. Precisely, mon ami. Dr. Edmund Bloom was not just her husband. He was a man deeply enmeshed in the web of family investments. He had much to lose if Henrietta exposed the truth. But let us not be hasty. We must be sure. Rimmer shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. I don't know what she discovered exactly, but I know she had started pulling the threads. Her contract was meant to secure more than just her book. There were clauses, terms, hidden in the paperwork, that connected her to more than just the publishing world. The real estate investments she was part of, it's all tied together. Poirot leaned back, his expression thoughtful. And Dr. Bloom? What role did he play in this? Rimmer hesitated, as though struggling to find the right words. I don't have all the details, Poirot. But Henrietta had been arguing with Edmund about her finances for months. They were on the brink of separating, but it wasn't just about their marriage. It was about money. Edmund wanted control of Henrietta's inheritance, and Henrietta had been wise enough to keep things in her own name. It made him furious. And when he found out that Henrietta was close to exposing things he had worked so hard to conceal, his voice trailed off, and he swallowed hard, as if the truth were too much for him to bear. Poirot's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place at last. The betrayal Henrietta had uncovered was not the petty rivalry between authors, nor was it an affair, but something far more insidious. Financial ruin, threats to her inheritance, and a betrayal that reached into the very heart of her family. It was Dr. Bloom, then, the husband who stood to lose everything if Henrietta had exposed his deception. Poirot stood up, his demeanour suddenly all business. We have our answers, Hastings. It is time to confront Dr. Bloom. But just as he turned to leave, Rimmer's voice stopped him. There's one more thing, he said, his tone uneasy. Henrietta wasn't just investigating her own finances. She was investigating mine too. She had started digging into my books, and she found things.
That... He stopped himself, eyes wide with fear. If anyone else finds out what she knew... Poirot's expression hardened.
You will have to trust me, Monsieur Rimmer. The truth is a dangerous thing, but it must be brought to light. And with that, the investigation shifted into its final phase. The truth was closer than ever, but the danger was far from over. Chapter 12. The web unravels. Poirot stood motionless for a moment, allowing the gravity of Rimmer's confession to sink in. The pieces of the puzzle were now so near to completion that he could almost taste the final truth. He exchanged a glance with Hastings, who had been silent throughout Rimmer's unsettling admission, his face furrowed in thought. Mon ami, Poirot said quietly, breaking the silence. The portrait of Henrietta is becoming clearer, n'est-ce pas? She was not merely a woman betrayed by love or ambition. She was a woman fighting to protect her future, and perhaps more importantly, her family's future from a very dangerous man. Hastings nodded slowly, his brow still knitted in confusion. But Poirot, are we saying that Dr. Bloom murdered his own wife over money? And Rimmer? Is he somehow involved in all this? Poirot turned to face him fully, his eyes narrowing with the intensity of his deduction. Yes, my friend, Dr. Bloom had everything to lose, his position, his wealth, his reputation, all built on deceit. Henrietta, with her sharp intelligence,
had been uncovering the threads of his web, a web woven with greed and manipulation, and she was not going to stop.
But why would she— Hastings began, but Poirot raised a finger, cutting him off. Because, he said softly, Henrietta had found the truth. She had discovered that the financial arrangement her husband had put into place was built on lies, lies that, if exposed, would ruin not only Dr. Bloom, but also those connected to him, including Monsieur Rimmer. It is not just a question of money, it is a question of power. Hastings frowned. But how does the manuscript fit into all of this? If Henrietta was so close to the truth, why would she go to such lengths to encode it in a book? Poirot took a step closer to the manuscript, his fingers lightly brushing the pages as though he were caressing the very essence of the victim's final message. The manuscript was Henrietta's lifeline, mon ami. She knew that exposing the truth directly—
It could be too dangerous. She could have been silenced just as she was.
But she left us a clue, a message encrypted in the form of symbols and patterns. It was her way of saying, I know the truth. Hastings was beginning to understand. So she was telling someone, maybe someone she trusted to follow the trail? Exactly, Poirot replied. Her most trusted allies were those who could protect her. She knew that someone would eventually uncover the truth hidden in the manuscript. And when she realized Dr. Bloom was no longer the man she thought he was, she feared
for her life.
So she encoded the evidence of his betrayal through the manuscript symbols, hoping that someone would decode it and bring him to justice. But the publisher— Hastings interjected. What's Rimmer's role in all this? You said he knew about the scam, but did he know Henrietta was onto it? Rimmer, you see, Poirot murmured, was complicit, though perhaps unwillingly at first. His business dealings with Dr. Bloom and Henrietta were intertwined. The success of her book was crucial to his publishing house, but more than that, her success would strengthen his own financial position. He was aware of the debts and the dealings that Henrietta was involved in. He had a stake in the whole situation. If Henrietta had exposed Dr. Bloom, the fallout would have hurt him, just as—
Much complicit in murder?
Hastings asked, more incredulously than surprised. Poirot paused, his expression pensive. Perhaps not directly, but Rimmer knew that Henrietta was on the brink of discovery. He may not have wanted her dead, but he certainly didn't want her to.
Reveal what she had learned. A murder can sometimes be the last resort of those desperate to protect themselves from ruin.
The room fell into silence, each man lost in his thoughts. Poirot knew they were on the cusp of something big, but a niggling thought tugged at his mind. He had a theory, yes, but something wasn't quite right. The pieces almost fit together, too perfectly, as though someone had designed the entire situation with care. And if that was the case, Poirot knew they were dealing with someone far more calculating than a mere opportunist. Breaking the silence, Poirot turned back to Rimmer, who had remained unnervingly still throughout the conversation, as though he were lost in his own thoughts. His hands had gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white, and his gaze had wandered toward the door, as if considering a quick escape. But he said nothing. "Rimmer," Poirot said, his voice suddenly sharp. "We must confront Dr. Bloom immediately. There is no time to waste." The publisher blinked, clearly startled by the command. "But you don't mean—" "I mean to expose the truth. The time has come to bring Dr. Bloom to justice." Hastings looked to Poirot, sensing the subtle shift in his friend's demeanour. "But you've just said that it was Bloom, Poirot. Do you suspect anyone else?" Poirot gave a wry smile. "It is always tempting to focus on one suspect, mon ami, and in this case the suspect appears to be Dr. Bloom. But—" He let the word hang in the air, turning toward the window as though considering something just beyond their grasp. "There is something more, something that still eludes me. I believe we are dealing with a man who is not as foolish as he seems. Dr. Bloom may not be the only one involved in this. There is someone else pulling the strings." Hastings frowned, but before he could ask further, Poirot continued, his voice quiet but intense. "I shall visit Dr. Bloom at once, but I fear we are not yet finished with this puzzle. We must be prepared for what we may uncover." As Poirot stood, readying himself to leave, Hastings hesitated for a moment. "Poirot, are you sure about this? What if you're wrong? What if Rimmer's not involved in all this?" Poirot turned to him, his eyes reflecting a steely determination. "We are all capable of hiding our true selves, mon ami. It is our nature. But the truth, as it always does, will find a way to emerge. I have no doubt that we are on the right track." With that, Poirot stepped toward the door, his mind already racing through the final steps of his theory. The pieces had fallen into place, but a lingering question remained. Was Dr. Bloom the only person with a hand in Henrietta's death, or had someone else, someone far more clever, been orchestrating everything from the shadows? Poirot's resolve hardened. He would soon have his answer. Chapter 13. Closing the net, Poirot paced slowly around the room, his eyes flicking from one face to another, each expression an unreadable mask. The tension was palpable, an almost tangible weight pressing down on the gathered group. Henrietta's murder had drawn them all here, to this very moment. But now, as Poirot stood at the centre of the room, it was clear that the game was nearly up. Each player had been trapped in their own web of deceit, and it was only a matter of time before the final revelation would come to light. In the dim light of the drawing-room, the suspects sat uncomfortably. Rimmer, the publisher, his face pinched, with anxiety, sat with his hands folded stiffly in his lap. Dr. Bloom, ever the composed professional, looked every bit the part of the innocent man caught in an impossible situation. Alice Pendleton, Henrietta's closest friend, appeared pale and weary, her eyes fixed on the floor. Claudia Green, the rival author, sat with a quiet, almost indifferent look, her fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of her chair. Poirot, however, showed no sign of hesitation. His mind had already arrived at the final solution, and it was now only a matter of drawing them all into his carefully laid trap. Hastings, who had remained silent for much of the conversation, now leaned forward slightly, catching Poirot's eye. The tension in the room seemed to stretch taut, but Poirot gave him a reassuring glance. "Mes amis," Poirot began softly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You have all been involved in something far darker than you would care to admit. You have played your parts well, but now it is time to reveal the truth." There was a collective shift in the room as each person braced for the oncoming storm. Poirot's sharp gaze lingered on Dr. Bloom, whose expression had tightened into something resembling defiance. "Doctor," Poirot said, his words slow but deliberate, "you, like many of us, were a man of ambition. You had built your life on a lie that threatened to collapse when your wife, Henrietta, uncovered the truth." Dr. Bloom's face paled, but he remained composed, a flicker of annoyance flashing in his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about, Poirot," he said smoothly, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Poirot stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Henrietta had discovered your little secret, had she not? The scam, the manipulation of her finances, your role in exploiting her trust. You feared she would expose you, destroy everything you had built." Poirot's eyes flickered toward Rimmer, whose nervousness was beginning to show. "And
you knew that if she went public with what she had learned, you would lose more than your reputation. You would lose your wealth."
Dr. Bloom swallowed hard, his gaze darting briefly to Rimmer before settling on Poirot once again. "You're mad," he said, his voice quivering just slightly. "I would never." Poirot held up a hand, cutting him off with a sharp gesture. "Do not waste your time denying the truth. You murdered her, Doctor. You killed her because she had the power to ruin you, and when you did, you thought you had silenced her forever." Rimmer shifted uneasily in his seat, the colour draining from his face. Poirot turned his attention to him now, his eyes narrowing. "You, Monsieur Rimmer, were not just a bystander in this affair. You were complicit," Poirot continued. "You knew of the debts Henrietta had accrued. You knew that her success was vital not only to her future, but to the future of your publishing house. When she discovered the full extent of Dr. Bloom's betrayal, you realized that if Henrietta went public, your business interests would be shattered. So you agreed to help cover up the crime. You may not have been the one to pull the trigger, but you were just as guilty of ensuring her silence." Rimmer's lips quivered, and he opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. His gaze flickered to Dr. Bloom, and for a fleeting moment it was clear that the publisher was not entirely innocent in this affair. Poirot's gaze swept over the rest of the room, settling on the faces of Alice and Claudia, both of whom had remained silent up to this point. Alice Pendleton, for her part, seemed shocked by the turn of events, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. Claudia, however, seemed almost indifferent, her eyes fixed on Poirot with a look of cool detachment. Poirot paused, as if savouring the final moment before his conclusion. "But there is more," he said, his eyes narrowing as he turned his attention toward Claudia. "You, Madame Green, have not been entirely honest with us either." Claudia's expression didn't shift, but Poirot could see the faintest flicker of wariness in her eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said coolly. Poirot smiled, his gaze cutting through her facade. "Ah, but you do, madame. You were Henrietta's rival, and you wanted her success for yourself.
You were aware of the manuscript's potential, and you knew that once it was published, it would make Henrietta a household name, a name that would eclipse your own." Claudia's lips twitched, her fingers drumming more rapidly on the armrest. "So what? You think I killed her out of jealousy?"
Her tone was mocking, but Poirot could see the undercurrent of something else, something that suggested more than just rivalry. Poirot shook his head, his expression turning serious. "No, I do not think you killed her, madame, but I do think You played a role. You knew that Henrietta was about to expose something much more dangerous than her professional rivalry with you.
You knew about her discovery of Dr. Bloom's scam, and perhaps you even encouraged her to keep quiet about it, knowing that the financial fallout would be disastrous for both her and the publisher. Claudia's eyes hardened, and she straightened
In her chair. I didn't kill her, she repeated, but this time there was a trace of uncertainty in her voice. Poirot's smile was faint but knowing. No, you did not, but in your own way, you too have been a part of this tangled web. He turned then to the group as a whole, allowing the silence to stretch before speaking again, his voice low but commanding. Henrietta knew something none of you wanted her to know. She had uncovered a secret that could destroy all of you, the scam, the betrayal, the manipulation, and she was about to expose it. The only way to stop her was to kill her, and you each played your part in that decision. Dr. Bloom murdered her to protect himself. Rimmer helped cover it up to protect his business, and you, Madame Green, played a part in encouraging the silence. The room was silent now, save for the faint ticking of a clock in the corner. Poirot stood still for a moment, watching the faces before him, the tension in the air almost suffocating. He had laid it all bare. Each person had been complicit. Each one had their own role in the tragedy, and yet the greatest mystery remained. Who had truly pulled the strings, and who had orchestrated the entire sequence of events from the shadows? Poirot paused for just a moment longer before giving a slight nod, his gaze settling on the group. "I have solved the puzzle," he said, his voice carrying a finality that resonated through the room. "But there is still one question left." As he stepped toward the door, he turned to face them one last time. The question is, who will face the consequences? Chapter 14. The final twist. The room had grown unbearably still after Poirot's last words. His eyes had locked onto each of the suspects in turn, his mind weaving the final threads of a complex tapestry. He had them. The murder was no longer an unsolvable riddle, but a closed case. Yet, even as Poirot stood there, his mind buzzed with a sense of unease, a feeling that gnawed at him, suggesting that something was still amiss. The puzzle might have been solved on the surface, but there was an undercurrent he hadn't fully addressed. Hastings, who had watched Poirot's theatrical unmasking with growing admiration, finally broke the silence. "So, Poirot, you're telling me that Dr. Bloom killed Henrietta because she was about to expose his financial scam with Rimmer's complicity?" He looked toward Rimmer, who remained unnervingly quiet. And Claudia, well, she seemed to have her own reasons to keep Henrietta quiet.
Jealousy, perhaps? Poirot nodded, but did not respond immediately. His gaze swept over the group, his sharp eyes observing each person as if searching for something he hadn't yet found. Something was still off. His suspicions were not fully
allayed. There was a depth to this case, a hidden layer he had yet to uncover. The room seemed to shrink around them as Poirot finally spoke, his voice soft but filled with a commanding certainty. "Yes, my friend, the pieces of the puzzle fall neatly into place. Dr. Bloom was desperate, Rimmer was complicit, and Madame Green, well, she played her part, though less directly than others, but there is still one thing that does not quite fit." "What's that?" Hastings asked, frowning. He had grown used to Poirot's ability to see the unseen, but this was different. Poirot was not yet satisfied. Poirot remained still, his face inscrutable, as he shifted his attention once more to the group. His mind spun through every detail, every conversation, every moment he had spent with the suspects. Then, like a light flicking on, the final piece clicked into place, and it was as if the fog had lifted. He turned sharply to Alice Pendleton, whose face had been pale but passive throughout their earlier conversation. "Alice Pendleton," Poirot said, his voice quiet but firm, the room freezing in anticipation. "You knew." Alice blinked, and, for the first time, there was a faint tremor of unease in her eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but lacking its usual conviction. Poirot took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You knew from the very beginning, didn't you? You knew what Henrietta was about to expose, and you were the one who manipulated everything behind the scenes. You orchestrated this murder, not out of greed, but out of something far more insidious. A betrayal, yes, but a personal one. You used your position as Henrietta's closest friend to manipulate her life, and in the end, her death." Alice's face, which had remained so composed up until this point, now blanched in an almost imperceptible change. Her lips pressed together, and for a brief moment she hesitated. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she stood up, her eyes meeting Poirot's with a calm defiance that made the hairs on the back of Hastings' neck stand on end. "You're wrong," Alice said, her voice low but steady. "I did everything for her, for Henrietta. She was my closest friend. We shared everything, but there are things you don't understand, things you couldn't understand." Poirot's expression remained unchanged, his eyes unwavering. "Then explain it to me, for if it is not greed, and if it is not fear of exposure, then what was your true motive?" Alice's hands curled into fists, and she seemed to gather herself, as if deciding whether or not to reveal the truth. A long, painful silence followed before she spoke again. "You want to know what I did, Poirot?" she said softly, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I loved her. I loved her more than anyone ever knew." She paused, her voice breaking for a moment before regaining its cold composure. "She didn't love me back, not the way I wanted. She had her family, her career, and even her husband, though he was no more than a tool to her. But she didn't love me." The revelation hung in the air like a heavy mist, and Hastings stared at Alice in disbelief, his mind struggling to piece together the implications of what she had just confessed. Alice's eyes locked onto Poirot's, her voice now cutting, sharp with emotion. She didn't know, of course. She didn't know that I had been the one to guide her steps, to encourage her, to help her write that damned book. But I did. I did all of it. I pushed her forward, knowing what it could bring, knowing what it could expose, the truth of her family, of her marriage, of her financial ruin. I helped her get close to the right people, Rimmer, Bloom, even Claudia. I was the one who pulled the strings all along. I wanted her to succeed, yes, but I also wanted her to need me, to see me for once as the person she couldn't live without. Hastings was speechless, his mouth dry as he looked between Poirot and Alice. The entire room seemed to shift as Alice's confession settled over them like a suffocating weight. Poirot, however, remained unflinching, his face inscrutable as ever. And when Henrietta discovered the truth, when she realized the extent of the deception— "What did you do?" Poirot asked quietly, his voice steady but carrying the full weight of the accusation. Alice's gaze faltered, her face tightening, as though she had been struck. I couldn't let her expose everything. I couldn't let her ruin everything we had built together. And so She stopped herself, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I had to stop her.
I had to make her realize that she couldn't go on without me. Poirot shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. You were blinded.
By obsession, Mademoiselle Pendleton. You had the opportunity to guide Henrietta to be her friend, and yet you chose to manipulate her. You used her. And when she was no longer under your control, you made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that she could never leave you, never expose the truth about your role in everything. Alice's eyes darted around the room, as if seeking an escape, but there was no way out. Poirot had seen through her carefully constructed facade, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Hastings was the first to speak, his voice laced with disbelief. You killed her. You killed your best friend for... What? Because she didn't love you the way you wanted? Alice met his gaze with a resigned bitterness. Love is a fickle thing, Captain Hastings. Henrietta never understood. She thought I was only her friend, but I was so much more than that.
I gave her everything, and in return she took it all for granted. Poirot, his expression colder than ever, took a step back, his arms folded across his chest. And now, Mademoiselle Pendleton, you must pay for what you have done. Alice
did not protest, nor did she attempt to flee. The weight of her actions seemed to finally settle upon her. She knew, as Poirot had known all along, that her web of lies had unravelled. Mon ami, Poirot said to Hastings, his voice soft but firm, sometimes it is not the loudest voice that is guilty. It is the quietest, the one hiding in the shadows, who orchestrates everything from behind the scenes. Hastings nodded slowly, finally grasping the full extent of the treachery that had unfolded before them. Poirot turned to face Alice once more, his voice steady but final. The truth, Mademoiselle Pendleton, is that your love for Henrietta led to her death, and for that you will pay the price. The room fell silent once more, the full weight of Poirot's words sinking in. Alice Pendleton, the devoted best friend, had been the mastermind all along, and now the final twist of the case had been revealed. Chapter 15. The Grand Reveal. The room was filled with a charged silence as Hercule Poirot stood in the centre, his hands clasped behind his back. The group of suspects had been summoned once more, and this time there would be no escaping the truth. His mind had sifted through the clues like grains of sand, and now, at long last, the last of them had fallen into place. He turned to face the assembly. Dr. Bloom, Claudia Green, Rimmer, and Alice Pendleton were gathered, each of them standing with a mixture of resignation, suspicion, and dread. The weight of the truth hung heavily in the air, and even the normally composed Hastings had adopted a quiet stillness, waiting for Poirot's words. Poirot's eyes darted across the group, his gaze sharp, yet filled with an almost paternal calm. You all have your stories, your reasons, your motives, but I have uncovered the one truth that ties all your lives together, the one truth that will answer every question. He paused, allowing the tension to build in the room, before continuing with deliberate precision. Henrietta Mallory's death was not an accident. It was not the result of a robbery gone wrong, nor was it the desperate act of a jealous lover or an ambitious rival. No, mes amis, it was the result of something far darker. Greed, yes, but also something much more personal. The suspects exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke. Poirot's manner was calm, his voice even, but beneath it all there was the unmistakable sense of someone in complete control of the situation. He turned now to Alice Pendleton, who had been standing near the window, her arms crossed in front of her chest, as if guarding herself from the inevitable confrontation. Alice, Poirot said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. You
knew all along. You were the one who manipulated Henrietta, used her, pushed her toward that final revelation, and in the end, when she threatened to expose you, you took everything from her. Alice flinched, her face paling as her composure
began to crack.
"You're wrong," she whispered, but the words were weak, lacking conviction. I never meant for things to go this far." "Ah, but you did," Poirot said, his tone unwavering. "From the beginning, you had a plan. Henrietta
Was not only your best friend, but also the key to your future. She had wealth, status, and a reputation, everything you thought you needed. You knew the book would expose her family's secrets, her debts, her betrayals.
But it was more than that, wasn't it? The book wasn't just a confession, it was a message. Alice's lips trembled as she looked down, unable to meet Poirot's gaze. Her mind raced, and in that moment, Poirot knew she was grappling with
The crushing realization that her secret was about to be fully exposed. You manipulated her, Poirot continued. You encouraged her to write the book, guided her every step, and used her fears and vulnerabilities to keep her on a path that was designed for your benefit. And when she discovered the full extent of your deception, the betrayal that lay at the heart of your friendship, you killed her to prevent the truth from coming out. A sharp intake of breath went around the room, but Alice, now visibly shaken, remained silent. Poirot turned his gaze to the others, each one of them tense as they absorbed his words. "Dr. Bloom," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You were an accomplice in the broader scheme, though perhaps you did not know all the details. You had your own motives, of course, your debts, your pride, but in the end you were a puppet to Alice's machinations." The doctor's eyes widened in surprise, and he stammered slightly. I don't understand. What do you mean?" Poirot held up a hand, his expression calm but resolute. "You, Dr. Bloom, were bound by your financial troubles. You wanted to keep your reputation intact, and you saw Henrietta as a threat to that. But your involvement with Alice is what sealed your fate. She had you under her control, didn't she? She knew about your blackmail, your indiscretions, and when Henrietta started to put the pieces together, she realized that your quiet life as a respected doctor was nothing more than a facade. You were afraid of what would happen if Henrietta exposed you, and so, like the coward you are, you allowed Alice to take the final step." Dr. Bloom's face twisted with anger, but the truth of Poirot's words was undeniable. "It's not true," he spat. "I never—" Poirot cut him off with a sharp glance. "No more lies, mon ami. The truth is plain for all to see. You knew what was happening, and you played your part, no matter how small you thought it was, because you were scared. And in your fear, you became a tool for a far greater betrayal." He turned back to Alice. "And you?" Poirot said, his voice low and filled with a rare edge of bitterness. "You used Henrietta, manipulated her. You pretended to be her friend, but in reality, you were nothing more than a parasite feeding
off her successes. You wanted her life, her wealth, her position. And when she threatened to take it all away from you, you murdered her in cold blood." Alice's eyes welled up, her face crumpling as the enormity of her actions settled upon
her. She opened her mouth to speak, but faltered, unable to find the words. Poirot's gaze softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. "You are not a monster, Alice, but you are a woman who allowed her darkest desires to blind her to the true nature of friendship and love. You let ambition and envy poison your heart, and in doing so, you destroyed the only person who ever truly trusted you." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of Poirot's words pressing heavily on everyone. Alice's shoulders trembled as if she were holding back the floodgates of emotion, but no one came to her aid. She had no one left. Poirot slowly approached. Her, his expression one of quiet, sad understanding. "You thought you were clever, yes? That no one would notice. But I have told you before, Alice, there is no such thing as a perfect crime. The smallest of clues, an overlooked detail in your book, a subtle shift in your behavior, these are the things that reveal the truth." Alice's hands twisted together in her lap, her fingers white with tension. "I never meant for her to die. I thought I could control it, keep it all hidden. But everything spiraled out of my reach. I couldn't stop it." Poirot nodded, his expression never faltering. "And that, Mademoiselle Pendleton, is the tragedy. In the end, you could not control the consequences of your own actions." He turned to the rest of the group, his gaze sweeping over them with the finality of a man closing a chapter. "And now the truth is known. The rest of you," he said, nodding toward Dr. Bloom and Rimmer, "will face the consequences of your involvement. As for you, Alice, you will pay for the crime you committed, one you never should have allowed to happen." A hush fell over the room, and Poirot stepped back, the finality of his words settling in the air like a thick fog. Justice has been done. The case is closed. As Alice's fate was sealed, a sense of resolution hung in the room, not just for the crime, but for the deep, often tangled human emotions that had led to it. Poirot turned to Hastings, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "There is nothing more to say, my friend. The little grey cells have worked their magic once again." And with that, the case of Henrietta Mallory was finally, irrevocably, brought to its conclusion.